When we talk about peace and justice and memory after a conflict, I mean, how do societies really heal? How do they actually build something new on, well, the ashes of what was destroyed? Today, we're taking a really close look at Nepal's journey. It's been grappling with the aftermath of a decade-long civil war. We're going to try and peel back the layers, looking at Nepal's struggle for justice, for healing, and ultimately for peace. We got human rights reports, academic studies, and crucially, the voices of victims themselves.
Yeah, and our aim here really is to understand why, almost 2 decades after a big peace agreement, the sort of ghosts of war still seem to haunt Nepal. We'll unpack the challenges specifically around transitional justice there, and maybe see what lessons Nepal's experience offers, for other post-conflict societies trying to rebuild. It's a profound impact we're talking about.
Okay, so to really get a handle on Nepal's situation, we first have to look at the sheer human cost. I mean, it's staggering. The Maoist conflict, it kicked off officially February 13, 1996, and it claimed around 17,000 Nepali lives. Just think about that number. This was this really brutal fight to overthrow the monarchy, set up a people's republic. And what came with it was just widespread violence, war crimes, crimes against humanity, terrible things like sexual violence, people just disappearing, extrajudicial killings, torture.
Yeah, the list is long and grim.
And to give you a sense, a really chilling sense of that brutality, let's talk about the Gaur massacre in 2007. It really stands out as one of the most gruesome acts of political violence in Nepal's recent history. March 21, 2007. You had 27 people linked to the Communist Party of Nepal, the Maoists, and one other unidentified person just brutally killed, another 53 injured. This followed clashes between another group, the Madheshi People's Rights Forum, or MPRF, and the Maoists in Gaur, down in the Radahat district.
Right, and the context around Gaur is, well, it's really important to understand. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It was during a period of real unrest in the Terai region, that southern belt of Nepal. Madheshi leaders were pushing hard for their demands, and investigations by the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, they noted that the local Madheshi people in Gaur felt really marginalized, discriminated against by the sort of hill area administration and police. You had an area rife with crime, weak security forces, and already a lot of anti-Maoist feeling because of past abuses like extortion, beatings, things people had directly experienced. It was a volatile mix.
So a real powder keg situation.
Absolutely. And the immediate fallout from Gaur was, well, stark. OHCHR Nepal said these incidents were a, quote, stark reminder that the enjoyment of and respect for fundamental human rights in Nepal are fragile and cannot yet be guaranteed effectively by the state. They pointed specifically to failures in protecting freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and basically said law enforcement needed urgent reinforcement. It just wasn't working properly.
Okay, so that paints a pretty grim picture of the violence. Let's shift now to what happened after the war ended. The promises made. We have the Comprehensive Peace Accord, the CPA, signed November 21st, 2006. This formally ended the war. Big changes followed. The monarchy was abolished. Nepal became a federal democratic republic. And crucially, this agreement and the 2007 interim constitution that followed committed Nepal to what's called a transitional justice process.
Right. And transitional justice, or TJ as it's often claimed, it's essentially a set of tools, some judicial, some not, that societies use to deal with huge past abuses. The aim is accountability, sure, but also justice more broadly, and reconciliation. The UN talks about 4 main pillars. First is truth, finding out what actually happened. Second, justice prosecution, holding perpetrators accountable. Third, reparation, compensating victims. And fourth, guarantees of non-recurrence, making sure it doesn't happen again.
Okay, 4 pillars. Sounds comprehensive on paper, but here's where it gets, well, deeply frustrating looking at the reality. Despite those commitments in the peace deal, nearly 16 years later, 16 years, not one single case of serious human rights violations from the conflict has been properly investigated and prosecuted according to international standards. Not one.
It's quite shocking, really.
Think about this. The CPA, the Peace Accord, actually said the names and addresses of everyone who disappeared or was killed would be made public within 60 days. 60 days. It never happened. Just never materialized.
And that points to the core challenge, doesn't it? Implementation. Or maybe lack of it. The government did set up 2 commissions back in 2015. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, and the Commission of Investigation on Enforced Disappeared Persons, CIEDP.
But the law that created them, it was fundamentally flawed from the get-go. Nepal's own Supreme Court repeatedly said any TJ process has to meet international standards. It has to lead to criminal accountability for gross human rights violations.
But the law didn't do that. No. The act actually allowed for amnesties for those very crimes. It was a direct contradiction. It got so bad that the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, refused to even provide technical support because of these issues. They basically said, this isn't a credible process as it stands.
Wow, so the foundations were shaky, to say the least, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Almost like designing it to fail, or at least not succeed in delivering real accountability.
Well, that's certainly the implication many draw. The repeated Supreme Court rulings being ignored, the international criticism. It strongly suggests a lack of genuine political will to confront the past head-on, especially when perpetrators might still hold positions of power.
Right. Political expediency over justice.
It appears that way. And this whole situation, this legal quagmire and lack of progress, it obviously has huge consequences. But it's not just legal or political.
You mean the human cost continues, even after the fighting stopped?
Exactly. It seeps into the very fabric of society.
Mm-hmm.
And one really critical area is mental health. How does this prolonged uncertainty, this lack of justice, actually affect people psychologically?
Okay, let's explore that, because often that gets overlooked, doesn't it?
It does, and we actually have some fascinating insights from a study done in Jumla, which is a rural district in Nepal. What's special about this study is that it was prospective, meaning it tracked the same people over time. It measured their mental health before the conflict really hit their area, around 2000, and then after direct exposure in 2007, 2008.
The same individuals. Wow, that's rare.
It's believed to be the first study like it in a low-income country context, really valuable data. And the findings, pretty revealing. Anxiety levels went up dramatically from about 26% before the conflict exposure to nearly 48% after. And there was a clear dose-response effect. The more bad things people experienced directly linked to the conflict, house searched, witnessing killings, being forced to feed armed groups, sexual violence, the higher their anxiety levels became.
So a direct link between trauma exposure and anxiety. That makes sense, sadly.
Yes. And this increase was significantly more than you'd expect just from people getting older over that period. Now, depression also increased from about 31% to just over 40%. But here's the interesting part. The study found this rise was largely explained by the natural aging of the population, not directly by the war trauma itself.
Really? So war wasn't the main driver for increased depression?
Not according to this study. For depression, other factors seemed more powerful, things like ongoing poverty, other stressful life events happening concurrently. Socioeconomic factors were stronger predictors.
That's a really important distinction.
It is. And another key finding. They looked to see if specific groups like women, the elderly, or marginalized castes, the Dalits, were uniquely vulnerable to the conflict's mental health impact. But they found these groups already had high rates of anxiety and depression before the conflict hit hard. It highlights these deep pre-existing societal problems, gender discrimination, caste discrimination, poverty that were already taking a heavy toll.
So the conflict piled on top of existing vulnerabilities,
Right.
rather than creating entirely new patterns of vulnerability based on those demographics.
Exactly. It challenges this assumption that maybe societies are just fine mental health-wise before a war hits. It suggests war trauma is a huge driver for anxiety, definitely. But for depression, these chronic social issues, poverty, discrimination, they might be just as, if not more, impactful in that context.
That's profound. I mean, the study actually found that being from a low-caste Dalit group had the same statistical effect size on anxiety as experiencing the highest level of conflict exposure.
Yes, the odds ratios were almost identical, 5.8 for being Dalit versus 5.73 for the highest conflict exposure group. It puts social injustice on par with war trauma in terms of its impact on anxiety in this context.
It really forces us to think about peace building differently, doesn't it? It's not just about ending the fighting or prosecuting crimes. It's about tackling those deep-rooted social inequalities, too, if you want genuine societal healing.
Absolutely. They're intertwined. You can't really separate them.
Which brings us neatly to another crucial, often overlooked element. What do the victims themselves actually want? What does justice mean to them? Our sources show this stark gap, really, between the high-level political talk and the actual needs felt on the ground.
Yes, that comes through very clearly. For many victims, when they talk about justice, it's not solely about courts and prosecutions, though that's often part of it. It's often described as something more holistic, living with dignity and seeing their daily needs fulfilled. It's deeply connected to their psychological well-being, their material needs, getting recognition for their suffering, and often wanting an official apology from the state.
So it's much broader than just legal accountability.
Much broader. Think about specific needs beyond just money. Though financial compensation is important, many received some interim relief but felt it came without any real acknowledgement of what happened. They talk about wanting memorials for the dead, official martyr status for those killed, help with education for children who lost parents, access to health care, ways to earn an income, social rehabilitation. And women face particular struggles, especially wives of men who disappeared or victims of sexual violence. They often battle not just economic hardship, but also significant social stigma within their communities.
And what about reconciliation? That word gets used a lot by politicians.
It does, but victims are very clear. Reconciliation cannot be a substitute for justice. You can't just paper over the cracks without acknowledging the crimes, without addressing these basic needs we just talked about, without genuinely including victims in the process. They're very reluctant to just forgive and forget. In fact, some explicitly warn that forcing reconciliation prematurely, without truth and justice, could actually backfire and fuel a culture of revenge down the line. It's a serious warning.
It really is. You have to earn reconciliation, it seems.
Precisely. And what's also really important here is the agency victims have shown they haven't just waited passively. Victims' organizations have sprung up, like the Conflict Victims Common Platform, the CVCP. And significantly, this is an umbrella group representing victims from both sides of the conflict.
Both sides. That's interesting.
Yes, united in their demands for truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees it won't happen again. They've run grassroots campaigns, lobbied the government, really pushed for a victim-centered approach, and they push back hard against the idea that their agenda is just donor-driven. They argue, quite forcefully sometimes, that the whole post-conflict agenda has been dominated by political elites and even some human rights groups pursuing their own priorities, not necessarily what victims need most.
So they're demanding a seat at the table on their own terms.
Absolutely. They want to be partners, not just beneficiaries.
Okay, so we've painted a picture of long delays, deep frustrations, flawed processes. But maybe, just maybe, there are some glimmers of hope. Are things starting to move? Finally.
Well, there's a very recent development that's quite significant. We mentioned the Gaur massacre earlier. On August 19th, 2025, just recently, Nepal's Supreme Court ordered an investigation into that massacre. An investigation that's been stalled for nearly 18 years.
18 years.
Yes. The court issued something called a writ of mandamus. It's basically a strong legal order compelling the Nepal police to act. They have to either explain why the case has been dormant for so long or, crucially, start fresh inquiries immediately. And this comes after a detailed report in 2023 from Nepal's National Human Rights Commission, which called the massacre premeditated, intentional, and cruel. Strong words.
That is significant. A writ of mandamus carries real legal weight. It's not just a recommendation. And for the victims who actually filed that petition with the court, you can imagine, they're calling it the first real step to justice after such a long, hard struggle. It's given them, quote, new hope, because it forces law enforcement's hand on a case that seemed politically untouchable.
Exactly. It cuts through the political shielding that seems to have protected those involved for so long. It mandates action.
So connecting this specific ruling back to the bigger picture, what does it signal?
Well, it aligns with what victims groups and civil society have been demanding all along. The core message is the government needs to respect the peace agreement, implement the Supreme Court's past directives consistently, amend those flawed TJ laws, and this is key, genuinely consult with victims, especially those in poor and rural areas who are often left out. They need comprehensive reparations, not just token payments. And they need victim organizations recognized as real partners in building peace.
So the path forward for Nepal's transitional justice, it's still clearly complex, fraught with challenges, but maybe the Supreme Court move on Gaur, plus that relentless pressure from victims, maybe it does signal a potential turning point.
It could be. It puts the ball firmly back in the government's and the justice system's court. Whether they follow through effectively remains to be seen, but it's definitely a positive legal step.
As we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, doesn't it? If a society doesn't manage to adequately address these deep wounds from past conflict, what does that failure teach its own future? What are the long-term consequences for stability, for trust, for well-being?
Yeah, it really brings it home. And maybe prompts us to ask more broadly. In a world that's constantly dealing with the aftermath of violence, how do we make sure that this whole process of seeking justice isn't just a political game? How do we ensure it's genuinely centered on victims? That it properly integrates things like mental health support, social inclusion, real accountability, to actually build a peace that's resilient, that's equitable, and that it might actually last? Thinking about Nepal's long journey, what really stands out to you?